and welcome to a new episode with Astrid, your APD. And I have an amazing guest today, a second repeater, and it's Ted Naiman. He's going to join us, and we're going to talk about quite a few things you'll be waiting for. Most of them will be around insulin resistance, PE diet, and we're going to do a rapid Q&A, overrated, underrated, on metabolic health. So stay tuned until the end because this is going to be really, really cool. It really comes down to what works for you and how better you can adhere to it. Hey Ted.
Hello, how's it going?
Good. I'm so happy to see you again.
Oh, hey, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Well, a great way to start relates to your book. So where this concept of protein and energy ratio originally came from?
So the whole concept of protein versus non-protein energy is in the medical literature. This is something that's been around forever. Like in the animal world, if you look at animal feed, the concept of nitrogen to non-nitrogen in animal feed, like the carbon to nitrogen ratio of animal feed, is a really well-known concept. And in the veterinary world, we've known about protein to non-protein energy ratios forever. And in the scientific literature, we've known that about it forever. And, you know, like doctors Raubenheimer and Simpson, these researchers from Australia, your neck of the woods, who have been looking at protein leverage hypothesis. They've been researching this in animals for decades. And so it's really not something that I came up with. It's not really original. All I've done is just sort of repackage it or rebrand it in a way that it kind of brings it to the forefront, because I personally think it's probably the single most important metric in terms of diet success in the modern food environment, especially. So it's really not my idea. I'm just rebranding and repackaging something that's been around forever. And the concept of protein versus non-protein energy is really something that isn't new at all. It's just underrated, in my opinion.
Okay, tell me a little bit about how this protein leverage theory came about and what does that mean?
Right, so the protein leverage hypothesis is really the work of doctors Raubenheimer and Simpson, these Australian researchers, and they have studied this in all sorts of animals, including humans. Of course, humans are animals. We're just monkeys that talk, basically. So they researched this in all sorts of animals, and they realized that lots of animals have a protein prioritization to their diet, where they will basically eat and eat and eat and eat until they get enough protein, and only then will they stop eating. And different animals have different rules of compromise. It's called a rule of compromise. So if you're not getting enough protein, some animals will just undereat protein to avoid eating too much energy. But humans will always overeat energy to get enough protein. So that's just how we're wired. So basically, everyone out there is going to eat calories until they get an adequate amount of protein. And that's what the protein leverage hypothesis is. And if you look at the past, 60 years of the global obesity epidemic, globally, proteins dropped from about 15% down to maybe 12.5% right now in the United States, and actually most countries. And so this drop of a few protein percent really explains a good percentage of the increase in calories we've seen and the increase in obesity that we've seen that mirrors it. So that's what the protein leverage hypothesis is all about.
And when you say about protein dilution, what does that mean in terms of like protein to energy ratio and eating more foods that are very high in calories, how that might dilute the protein into really getting to our protein requirements?
Well, okay, so if you look at all of history and what humans have done to get food, humans have always used technology to feed ourselves, right? So 10,000 years ago in the Paleolithic, you'd just kill an animal and eat the whole thing. You getting plenty of protein, but you're probably still hungry for energy. So we were constantly looking for more energy calories to add to our diet. Honey, tubers, fruit, fatter animals, fattier parts of animals, bone marrow, brains, whatever we could get those calories, we're constantly seeking it out. We're wired to look for this high energy density, any kind of carbs, fat, whatever we can get. So humans invented agriculture because we realized, oh, if we, grow all these crops, we have way more calories for way less work. And if we domesticate animals and feed them really well, we get fatter animals and we get more calories from each animal. And this is a way of increasing the calories in our food, the non-protein energy, the carbs and fats. And then we invented industrial revolution and bulk refining and processing of sugar and flour and oil. And now we've got just tons of refined carbs and tons of refined fats, and we've dumped them all into the food supply, and they're awesome. It's like unlimited energy, super tasty and yummy and rewarding and addictive and fantastic, really long shelf life, really high profit margin. And now the whole food supply is just super diluted. The protein and minerals are just completely diluted with these refined carbs and refined fats. And that's how we dropped the protein percentage of our entire food environment. And that's why we have protein dilution.
Mm, that's a really good story, and I guess it makes sense to see how much some people can have a lot of calories and not really get enough protein until they have the adequate amount of calories to really get these proteins for the certain sources. Like when we compare someone who is an omnivore compared to someone who is like a vegan or vegetarian, or just the type of foods we select that might not be as a high protein quality. So when you look at these differences in terms of protein quality and sources of foods, what would be your stance on the quality and the protein sources that we look for when it comes to get this adequate amount of protein?
Well, we're already in this protein diluted environment where we don't have enough protein, right? So it is kind of a big deal in terms of how much the protein is actually bioavailable and how complete the protein is. And we have these different protein digestibility and availability scores. So like, the highest score you can get is something like egg white or whey protein. These are very digestible, very bioavailable, very complete. And then you go down the list and you have proteins that are bound up maybe with fiber and other anti-nutrients in plant foods, or you have proteins that are incomplete. So unfortunately, certain proteins are less bioavailable, less digestible, less complete. And if we were all eating tons of protein, it wouldn't matter as much. But since we're just barely skating by on protein to begin with, it starts to be kind of a big deal how bioavailable and complete your protein is. So unfortunately, animal foods are always superior to plant foods when it comes to protein. And you can make a plant-based diet work, but you have to go out of your way to eat more protein and to combine proteins and to just pay attention to the proteins a little bit more. It's a little bit harder.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is a little bit of a challenge when you work with a client or a patient that is a vegan or vegetarian, and you really want them to have an adequate amount of protein that gets them not just protein, but also like good quality protein, that that everything they will eat protein based is going to be absorbed and utilized and not just wasted in somehow.
Right, definitely.
Now, let's move on to when you talk about progressing your diet, when we want to move a person who is trying to optimize the diet, what are the strategies that you can tell us about to improve and optimize your diet in a progressive way?
Right. I think it's important to progress this kind of gradually. You wouldn't take somebody who's never bench pressed before and just put 400 pounds on the bar and say go for it. Maybe they can bench press 50 pounds, and then you just micro load little 2.5 pound plates and go from there. It's the same thing with your diet. Instead of just saying, okay, from now on all you eat is whey protein, it's just 100% egg whites and whey protein. That's never going to work. You can't do it. It's not enjoyable. It's not sustainable. So you have to enjoy the process. You have to play the long game. You have to like what you're eating. It has to be something you can do long term. And so I like the progression principle where, okay, now for breakfast you're just eating, straight donuts and that's it. Maybe you go to oatmeal because it has higher protein percentage than donuts. Or maybe you eat some eggs, or maybe you have some eggs and turkey bacon, or maybe you have some egg whites and turkey bacon. I mean, you can just really progress it. And as you go up this protein percent ladder, you're basically going to get higher and higher satiety per calorie, which means you're basically going to eat less calories. And you really just want to slowly, incrementally increase where you're at.
I really like that idea and that strategy, because that's what I find in my patients. Generally, they're eating less than 70 grams of protein, and usually my first aim is like, well, let's aim for a little bit more and optimize it from there. For example, if they're eating 62, 65 grams of protein, well, how about just trying to increase that target to 75 or 80, and just make it gradually, increasingly, so we can aim for something that is realistic, and the client is not going to be overwhelmed on, well, I can't get to eat from 65 grams of protein to 150 grams of protein. How am I going to do that? When it comes to protein specifically, with your patients, you mentioned the oatmeal and maybe just swapping some foods around, but how do you work with specific targets that maybe you're aiming for 100 grams or 150 grams, or like a gram per pound of body weight, and then you're trying to move them towards that goal? How do you go about that?
Right. So in a perfect world, I would have people at least temporarily track their macronutrients so they know exactly what they're eating. And then a really solid starting point for me would be a gram per pound of ideal body weight, not a gram per pound of what you actually weigh, but a gram per pound of what a reference weight would be for your height. And that's what I like to use as kind of a rough starting point.
I know that humans are amazing, and I think you talk a lot about this in terms of how adaptable machines and survival machines we are. So in your book, you discuss the adaptability principle, SAID, a specific adaptation to impose demand. Do you want to elaborate more on this particular acronym?
So the SAID principle, it basically means that your body will adapt to whatever you demand from it. So, for example, if you just never eat any carbohydrates, you're demanding that your body survive on no carbs, and you will in fact upregulate fat oxidation, and you will in fact become better at running your whole metabolism off of stored body fat or dietary fat. And then like your body will adapt to the things that you make it do. And that's what this whole principle is in the book. Your body is constantly adapting to your environment. If you're completely sedentary, your body will literally resorb all your lean mass just to be more efficient. Versus if you just do, push-ups all day long, just constantly push-ups. Your body has to adapt. You have to get stronger and better and more efficient at a push-up, because that's what you're demanding of your body. So your body is constantly changing. It's constantly adapting to fit into the environment as well as it can. It's a survival machine. That's what your body is. And so sometimes you want to impose demands on your body that fit with your goals, so your body will adapt. And that's what the whole book is about, really.
Yeah, it's trying to find what the person's goal is, and from there, make sure you're optimizing as much as possible all the conditions to make it more successful. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Okay, it makes sense. What do you mean or refer when you say decreasing carbohydrate frequency? So I know in your book, there's advocacy for what's your preference, what's your goal, and go from there. But there is a point where you mentioned that carbohydrates or too much carbohydrate or too much fat, it's not great to have it in an excessive amount because of that protein and energy ratio. So you mentioned in some parts of your book decreasing the carbohydrate frequency. So what type of carbohydrate are you referring to here? Or is it similar to maybe saying optimizing carbohydrate distribution throughout the day to make it more evenly, especially when we talk about and you're educating clients with diabetes or PCOS and you're trying to manage better the blood sugar levels? Is it the same? or are you more referring to reducing the window where you eat carbohydrates? Oh, explain a little bit more on that.
Well, the whole point of the book is eating a higher protein percentage. In order to do that, not only do you have to eat a little bit more absolute protein, but you have to basically eat less carbs and less fats. So like
Yeah.
every single person on the planet probably needs to be eating less carbs and less fat. And carbohydrate is probably the most egregious in today's society because the average American is eating 300 grams of carbs at 100 grams of fat and maybe 91 grams of protein on average. And so because the average American does 0 minutes of high intensity exercise per day, that's literally an actual statistic. Our need for glucose is not that high. So most people are fairly sedentary. You're not doing any high intensity exercise. You really don't need more than 125 grams of carbs a day. And since you're not depleting muscle glycogen, if you're eating a lot more than that, you're probably just shooting yourself in the foot from a body composition perspective. So one of the big points of the book is, hey, you need to eat more protein and less carbs at the same time. There are different ways of eating less carbs. Of course, if you're just a bodybuilder and you're tracking all your macros, it's easy. You just eat less carbs, and then it doesn't matter what carbs you eat or where you space them out in the day. It literally doesn't matter because you have iron discipline and you're just going to make it work and you're going to fit your macros. But the average person who's not super disciplined and not a bodybuilder and not tracking everything, they might need some sort of tricks to reduce their carbohydrate intake. One possible option is just eating foods that are lower in carbohydrates, food choice. Another option is some sort of windowing, so you're not eating carbohydrates as frequently. That could be intermittent fasting. That could be a cyclical ketogenic diet where you're just eating carbs, once a day. That could be carb backloading. That could be targeting carbohydrate around your workouts where you just eat carbs before your workout and after. There are different time strategies for reducing your carbohydrate intake. So I suggested a reduction in carbohydrate frequency as just one possible strategy of eating less carbs, which honestly everyone needs to be doing.
I hope you enjoyed this episode, and make sure you subscribe to my channel and hit the bell button so I can provide you with more information every time I upload a video. So stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you so much. Okay, that makes much more sense now. And when we think about the type of carbohydrates, does that really matter when it comes to choosing what type of carbohydrate you're going to eat? Obviously, bear in mind that we are referring to someone who is not necessarily an athlete or someone who is in a calorie deficit. But when we equate calories and protein, let's say calories and protein are equated, does carbohydrate type matter very much? Like whether you eat potatoes or whether you eat rice or whether you eat a donut or a sugar or someone that is more specifically carbohydrates. Does that really matter very much?
It matters hugely. So it really comes down to satiety per calorie, which is the most important factor of all. And satiety per calorie is huge when it comes to the category of carbohydrate. For example, if you were going to eat 400 calories of carbohydrate from sugar, that would be about a quarter cup of sugar. And if you eat the same 400 calories from strawberries, that's 4 pounds of strawberries. That's 12 cups of strawberries. That's like an obscene, ridiculous, insane amount of strawberries that you couldn't even eat. Now, I can dissolve the quarter cup of sugar in a glass of water or make some Kool-Aid out of it and drink it, and I will literally have zero satiety. Not only that, I might be hungrier 2 or 3 hours later than if I had never had the glass of Kool-Aid. Versus eating pounds of strawberries, I'm not going to be hungry for a long time. So definitely, when it comes to carbohydrate, I think carbohydrate, the quality matters more than almost anything else, any other macro, because carbohydrate quality is vastly different between high satiety per calorie carbs and low satiety per calorie carbs.
When you say low, like when you put the satiety term in there, are you referring to those type of carbohydrates that perhaps are higher in fiber? So obviously they're more filling versus the ones that are lower fiber. So obviously sugar doesn't have any fiber in it, so there's not going to create any satiety. Is that what you're implying?
Right, right. So basically, the things that contribute to this satiety would mostly be fiber, but also water and protein and minerals and other thing. There's a little bit of fat, a little bit of protein, a little bit of minerals, lots of water and fiber in the strawberries, and all of these would contribute to satiety per calorie. It would be weight, volume, fiber, water, protein, fat, anything that's not just a straight carbohydrate. So the berries would be a low carb. The sugar would be a high carb.
Okay. And when you say that you take the Kool-Aid and you drink it and you probably would be hungrier than even if you had it in the first place, why would that be?
So some people, when they eat a very high glycemic carbohydrate and get this big spike of blood sugar and insulin, they might actually have some hypoglycemic sensations, 2, 3, 4 hours later. I think everyone's experienced this. If you just have, cereal with fat-free milk and a slice of toast for breakfast, 3 hours later, you might just be extremely hungry. Some people get shaky and feel like they're going to die if they don't eat something. This is sort of a hypoglycemic sensation. Frequently, your blood sugar is technically in the normal range, but because it was so high before and because it's falling so rapidly, some people have these hypoglycemic sensations, especially a few hours after a meal that had no protein and no fat and no fiber and just a high glycemic index carb. If you want to experience this, just drink a half a gallon of orange juice for breakfast and nothing else and wait about 3 hours and just see how you feel.
I hope you enjoyed this episode and make sure you subscribe to my channel and hit the bell button so I can provide you with more information every time I upload a video. So stay tuned and keep watching. When do you think carbohydrate quality becomes so meaningful and important, provided that calories and protein are equated? I asked it before, but this now is more related towards when we have conditions like diabetes or PCOS, or any patient that might be experiencing insulin resistance. When does the type of carbohydrates, even now here, becomes a little bit more important to manage blood sugar levels or even achieve a better body composition and manage satiety and these kind of things?
Right. Well, there's a lot of factors there. First of all, if you're on the insulin resistant spectrum or a type 2 diabetic, one of the first things you lose is the ability to secrete a bunch of insulin all at once. So to deal with these high glycemic index foods. So, if you eat boiled potatoes, for every 100 gram of boiled potato, there's only 10 grams of actual carbs, compared with sugar, where 100 grams of sugar is 100 grams of glycemic carbs, and they're converted to blood sugar within just a few minutes, versus an hour for the potatoes. So you get this spike of insulin that is lost when you have insulin resistance or prediabetes or diabetes, and then you get some really extreme blood sugar excursions. And this will definitely mess with people. They can sort of feel this, and it's far from optimal. So I do think that eating lower carbs or a lower glycemic index is helpful for people who are already insulin resistant. I think that's a really good strategy. And of course, you're also going to automatically get more satiety per calorie, so you're just going to eat less. So there's a lot of reasons why you'd want some fiber and water and protein and minerals in your carbohydrate rather than just sugar, like I'm saying.
Okay. So would you say that a high fat diet like keto diet or like maybe a carnivore or very just high protein be better versus someone who has a lot of carbohydrates? Or could you, like if you were able to achieve the amount of protein and fiber, would it matter very much whether you eat more fat or more carbohydrates?
I think if protein and calories are matched, you're probably not going to see any outcome differences varying carbs and fats within reason. I do think that if you go below about 20% of your calories from fat, you might start having some issues that would be suboptimal. And I also think that when you shave the carbs to absolute zero, it's suboptimal as well. So I think that you don't really want to go below 10 or 20% of calories from either of those macros. But beyond that, if protein calories are matched, there's probably a lot of room for switching between those macros just based on how people feel. I do think that some people are going to have higher satiety per calorie on a lower carb diet, and some people have higher satiety per calorie on a higher carb diet. And I think there's definitely some room for individual adjustments there. I think the primary factor is protein percentage.
Yeah, I agree. Which conditions would you think they would benefit from having just lower carbohydrates, perhaps, and just more fats and protein?
Well, I think that every person you could name should be eating more protein and less carbs. Pretty much everyone. Like everyone you work with. I haven't met everyone you're working with, but I already know they need more protein and less carbs. That's like universal in the modern food environment. Basically universal. I do think that most people are probably eating enough fat. I think there's very few people who I would look at and say, you need to eat a lot more fat. I really don't think, honestly, I think the worst thing that ever happened to low carb is tacking high fat on the end of it. I'm not a big fan of low carb, high fat diets. If you're a diabetic, for example, reducing carbohydrate will immediately lower your postprandial blood sugars, but increasing fat will raise your fasting blood sugar. So if you eat a whole bunch of fat tomorrow morning, your blood sugar is going to be higher than it was today. So both of these energy macros are not ideal when you're energy toxic and insulin resistant or pre-diabetic or have type 2 diabetes, which is half the population here in America. So I'm really not a fan of increasing fat. I get nervous when anyone even uses the words high fat. Love low carb, love high protein. Not a huge fan of high fat.
Yeah. And if you were to say we have this a high protein diet, and we are looking into the quality that the fats are playing into your diet, how important is the quality of fats when we are really having a really high protein diet? Most of the times already some fat comes with your protein sources. So how do you manage to have a good ratio of monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, and saturated fats so you don't blow your saturated fats to the roof?
Right. I think the biggest problem is omega-3 to omega-6 ratio in the modern food environment. And you can definitely improve that if you just throw out your industrial seed oils. And if you try to eat more food that are animals eating what they're supposed to eat, your grass-fed beef, for example, is going to have way better omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. Your wild-caught fish and seafood, way better omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. So if you eat properly raised animal products, and then if you're focusing on protein, you're going to eat leaner animal products as well. You're going to eat the grass-fed beef. You're going to get the leaner cuts of beef. You're not going to be afraid of a chicken breast, for example, and you're going to automatically end up eating way less omega-6 fats when you're on this PE sort of diet where you're focusing on protein and constantly trying to shave down grams of fat and grams of carbs. You'll automatically get less omega-6. You'll automatically get less saturated fat. You're targeting things like fish and seafood and shellfish and grass-fed beef that are high in omega-3 anyway, and it's pretty much just going to automatically normalize the types of fats that you're eating. You're going to get more monounsaturates. You're going to get more omega-3 polyunsaturates. You're going to get less saturated fat. You're going to get less omega-6. It's kind of a win across the board from fat quality, in my opinion.
I agree. I agree. Just swapping some things around, choosing leaner protein sources, and selecting more foods that are richer in omega-3s, like your fish and some grass-fed beef. But now, when we talk about type 2 diabetes being 100% preventable, because we talked about this in our last episode on that we could definitely can reverse type 2 diabetes. How can, if we think about PCOS, insulin resistance, or type 2 diabetes, when we explain that perhaps the excess of body fat is what is causing insulin resistance, if the excess of body fat is not necessarily the problem, how can we explain or prevent type 2 diabetes in the first place in these situations that perhaps obesity or excess of body fat might not necessarily be the direct root cause?
Well, I would disagree with that. I would say that overfatness is always the cause of insulin resistance. Pathological insulin resistance is always from overfatness. Now, you might not look obese. You might have a low BMI, but your fat cells are overfilled, and so the fat you're eating has no place to go, and you're storing fat ectopically, and that's what insulin resistance is. So even someone who looks thin and someone who has a low BMI has exceeded their personal fat threshold, and their subcutaneous fat cells are large in diameter, and they've run out of fat storage. And that's what pathological insulin resistance is. So anyone who has anything on the insulin resistance spectrum is technically over fat, even if they look really lean.
So in that case, what would you do? Would you just try to make them change the body composition in the first place to see whether they gain more muscle mass, and so they have more room to increase their insulin sensitivity? Or what would you go about it?
Correct. Like no matter what they look like, or no matter what their BMI is, they basically will benefit from having lower stored fat and higher lean mass. So you're trying to do the same recomposition trick with anyone on the diabetes spectrum. More lean mass, lower fat mass. It's what you're trying to do. I don't care what anyone's weight is, or their BMI, or their waist circumference. If you're insulin resistant, you need less fat and more lean mass. And that's recomp, and that's what everyone's looking for. So it makes it really, really simple. It doesn't matter if you're trying to look better naked. It doesn't matter if you're trying to improve your health. Everyone's looking for the exact same thing: more lean mass, lower fat mass at the same time. That will always make you more insulin sensitive and look better. And it really just comes down to a higher protein to energy ratio of your diet to give you a higher protein to energy ratio of your body.
Yeah, I think we agree on that as well. I just had this question, and I really wanted to know your opinion on the body fat percentage and the insulin resistance. When we think about stress makes you fat, or when someone says cortisol makes you fat or makes you gain weight, what is your stance on that statement?
Well, cortisol can't actually make you gain fat if you're not eating the calories. But what cortisol does is worsen body composition. You're more likely to break down protein for energy and store energy as fat. So if I take someone and I don't change their calories, but I dump in a lot of cortisol, they'll just get worse body composition, less lean mass, more fat mass. So what cortisol is doing is worsening body composition, the exact opposite of what you want. It also tends to make people hungrier, and then they do eat more calories and typically gain weight.
Yeah. And would you say that when we think about that statement of stress makes you fat, is because of that reason, or would it be because some people will tend to emotionally or stress eat, and they generally, where they're searching for comfort or feeling a little bit better, generally these type of foods are not going to necessarily be a carrot or a banana. It's more likely to be like a highly palatable, very delicious and comforting food. Would you agree with that?
Right. It's all of those things. You're trying to raise dopamine in your brain. You're trying to feel better. You're literally hungrier. You're partitioning more into fat storage. It's all of those things together, definitely, for sure.
I like when I hear you say that we are all bodybuilders, but obviously we are generally responsible for the choices we make for our body and the body we have. So tell us a little bit more about that. How do you become a great bodybuilder?
So, and I think this is what people don't realize, is that your body is literally constantly adapting to your environment. And if you just lay in bed, if you go to the space station for a month or two in zero gravity, you'll literally lose lean mass, lose muscle, lose bone. Your body will just immediately reabsorb all of that. And when you come back, you won't even be able to walk. On the other hand, if you're just constantly lifting weights over and over and over and over and over, your body has to get stronger. You have to get higher bone density. You have to have more lean mass. And so your body is very fluid and plastic and dynamic, and it's constantly changing in response to the environment. If you're eating more energy, you just automatically store more fat. If you're eating less energy, you store less fat. If you're it's the specific adaptation to impose demand. If you're imposing these demands in your body, you have to change. If you're not imposing these demands in your body, you're going to change as well. And so I think a lot of people don't realize that all of their diet and exercise choices are just constantly remodeling their body, lean mass and fat mass, every meal, every day, all day, every day. What you're doing has created the phenotype that you've got, the body that you've got. And on one hand, it's like, oh, now I have to take accountability for that. But on the other hand, it's very empowering because you can like mold it any way you want.
I agree. I think it is so important to think that you have the responsibility and the power to change your body and remodel as you want, especially when we think that this theory of the body types and you have to eat according to your body type and the body type diet, that you can shift your body type. If you're endomorph, you can definitely transform into a mesomorph. Well, you shape your body composition, and you can definitely transform that because you have the power to adapt and modify your lifestyle environment and the things you do on a daily basis. So I think it is so good that association that you make about all being bodybuilders, not necessarily going to a stage, but like how we build our bodies.
That's right.
All right. So I had a question that one of our followers made, and they were asking how much protein can be too much before fat gain is happening from a surplus of calories. In the extreme that, like if someone only ate protein, how much protein would be too much that you exceed your maintenance calories and you get to a surplus? Or if you ate a normal diet, but you end up eating 100 more grams of protein that puts you on a surplus, how much perhaps would be too much that actually starts putting you in a position of gaining fat?
Well, we definitely have studies in the medical literature where they basically dumped 1,000 calories of protein on top of people's pre-existing diets. And interestingly, these people gained the lean mass went up, energy expenditure went way up, fat mass really did not go up. So we know that 1,000 calories of protein on top of your diet does not seem to increase fat mass. Now, I'm sure it's variable, and there's probably a point where you will absolutely start gaining fat. But 1,000 calories extra protein on top of your diet, that's a hell of a lot. So it's probably something that most people don't need to worry about. Now, I also don't know what happens when you try to feed any animal a 100% protein diet. Like, is it going to starve to death from energy starvation, even if it has unlimited access to protein? We don't know. That study's never been done. It probably wouldn't pass the IRB because most animals will die if they eat no fat at all. So I don't know what happens if you eat 100% protein, but that's something I'd like to know, but I don't want to kill any animals to find out.
I think when we look at like just eating, if we are eating animal or like real food protein sources, we are definitely finding that foods in general are not made on one macronutrient, so they generally will bring some additional macronutrients. If like they're plant-based, it probably will come with some type of carbohydrates and fats, or if they're animal-based, it probably will come with some fat as well. So a pure diet protein would be like if you only were having like a whey protein powder. I think that's the only way that you would be able to have only protein and not any other macronutrient, because there's no solely foods in the world that are just mainly one macronutrient by itself. Would you agree on that?
That's correct. There's only two foods on Earth that are just one pure macronutrient. Sugar is pure carbohydrate. It's the only food with no protein or fat. And oil is pure fat without any protein or carbs. And those are probably the two biggest foods you'd want to avoid.
Correct. Perfect. All right, let's move to one question that I really wanted to ask you before we move to the rapid Q&A on underrated, overrated. So how would you define metabolic health, and how can we make this our metabolic health as optimal as possible?
Got it. Okay, so for me, metabolic health is the ability to eat anything I want and easily dispose of all those macros, right? Or really the carbs and the fat macronutrient. So disposing of fat, you use your fat cells. If your fat cells are, shrunken down, let's say your fat cells are half full or 25% full, you can eat all the fat you want. Your fat cells just suck it right out of your bloodstream on the first pass. People who are very lean and have small insulin sensitive fat cells, their triglycerides are always low. They can eat an oral fat tolerance test, for example, and their triglycerides stay fairly low because the fat cells just suck the triglycerides right out of the bloodstream on the first pass. When you have people who are over fatted, they have abdominal obesity, they're insulin resistant, their fat cells are all huge and too full, the triglycerides just circle forever, and you'll see overfat people whose triglycerides are extremely high. And that's basically because they have no place to put fat energy because their fat cells are already too full. Same thing happens with glucose, but in this case, mostly in your muscles. So your muscles are the biggest sink for glucose. It's the biggest place that glucose goes. If you don't have a lot of muscle and you never deplete your muscle glycogen, the muscles typically stay, mostly full of glycogen for emergency use. So if you're not depleting it and you're not exercising and you don't have a lot of muscle to begin with, you have very little room to dispose of glucose. You can maybe fit 100 grams in your liver every 24 hours, and that's about it. So if your fat cells are full and your muscle cells are full of glycogen because you're over fat and you never exercise, then you have horrible metabolic flexibility and you can't dispose of glucose or fat. And you eat the two together and you have high triglycerides, you have high glucose, you have a high triglyceride glucose index, which is the product of the two in your bloodstream. And you're just energy toxic, and that's the absolute worst case scenario. And that's why all your type 2 diabetics have sky high triglycerides and sky high glucose all the time. But you take somebody like a bodybuilder who's dieted down and they're super, super lean, tons of lean mass, constantly depleting glycogen, lots of room in their fat cells. They have extreme insulin sensitivity and extreme metabolic flexibility. They could just eat a whole pizza and just whoop, the calories are gone. They can easily dispose of all the glucose and all the fat. And to me, that's what metabolic flexibility really is.
So would that metabolic flexibility be the same as metabolic health?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So if you were to say in a very simple sentence what metabolic flexibility or metabolic health is, what would that be?
I would say having plenty of room for energy macronutrient storage and being able to easily dispose of incoming energy macronutrients.
Would you say that also being able to see your biomarkers or like your blood work, noticing that there's no issues like you have low triglycerides, no high HbA1c, no insulin resistance, that kind of thing? Would you say that could be like a good sign of metabolic health too?
Absolutely, and the main markers you're looking at is a fasting insulin, fasting triglycerides, fasting glucose. These are all going to be low in someone who's metabolically healthy and has metabolic flexibility. But they're all going to be high in someone who doesn't. You'll see fasting insulin go up and fasting triglycerides go up, and the last one to go up is fasting glucose. But all of these will be high in someone who's on the diabetes spectrum.
Okay.
I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions or any comments, please comment below, and I'll be sure I'll answer to this as soon as I can.